The man who had this job before me left a small recorder sitting in the middle of the control desk, and on the side of it, scratched in with the point of a key or a screwdriver, are 3 words. Don't believe yourself. I've thought about those words every single night since I found them, and I want to tell you what I think they mean, because I'm running out of time to tell anyone anything they'll trust, including myself, maybe especially myself. So listen the way you'd listen to a man who isn't sure his own voice belongs to him anymore, because that's exactly the kind of man I've become. I should say up front that I'm not going to ask you to believe me. That would be hypocritical, given the warning. I only ask that you let me lay it out in order, the way it happened, the way I wrote it in the logs, even the parts I have no memory of writing, because that's where this whole thing lives, in the gap between what I did and what I remember doing. I used to think those were the same place. They're not. I learned that at the Halvern Reach Diversion Works, and I learned it too late, the way you learn most things that matter. Let me start with why I was even there, because if you don't understand that, you'll think I was stupid, and I wasn't stupid. I was something worse. I was a man trying to fix himself with a job. 2 years before any of this, I worked nights at a residential care facility about an hour from where I grew up. A quiet place, low and warm, the kind of building that smells of floor cleaner and the breath of sleeping people. My responsibility was the East Wing, 11 rooms, mostly elderly residents who needed someone awake in case a call light came on. It was the kind of work where nothing happens for weeks, and then everything happens in 4 minutes, and the whole point of you is to be awake for those 4 minutes. I was good at it. People told me I was good at it. The families used to ask for me by name. I knew which residents liked the hall light left half on and which ones wanted it black. I knew that room 9 called out in her sleep and meant nothing by it, and that room 6 only ever pressed her light when something was really wrong, because she hated to be a bother, and would lie there working up the nerve for an hour before she'd disturb anyone. And then there's a window of about 40 minutes that I cannot account for, not won't, can't. Room 6 pressed her call light, and the system logged it with a time, in clean machine print that nobody could argue with, and I did not respond, and by the time anyone found her it was over. The light was still glowing in the hallway when they found her, soft and amber and patient, the way those lights are, just waiting for the person whose whole job was to come. The review found that nothing could have been done even with immediate response. They were kind about it. They said the words you say. They used the phrase "no fault" several times, and I have come to hate that phrase, 'cause fault is at least a shape, fault is at least something you can hold and turn over. And what they handed me instead was a smooth nothing. Here is the thing I have never been able to put down. I don't know where I was for those 40 minutes. I don't remember sleeping. I don't remember leaving the desk. I don't remember being anywhere. I remember sitting in my chair watching the hallway, and then I remember the morning light coming gray through the day room windows, and in between there is a wall, smooth and blank, with no seam in it anywhere. I have run my mind along that wall 1,000 times, feeling for the crack where the lost time should join back on, the way your tongue goes again and again to the gap where a tooth used to be, and there is nothing. People kept telling me to forgive myself, and I kept thinking, forgive myself for what? I don't even know what I did. You can't forgive a blank. You can only stand in front of it. And the worst part, the part I never said out loud to the counselor they sent me to, was that some nights I wasn't sure I deserved to even know. Maybe the blank was a mercy. Maybe whatever I did or didn't do in those 40 minutes was something a man shouldn't have to carry the picture of. I lay awake choosing between 2 unbearable things, and that is a kind of waking I never fully came back from. So when I saw the listing for a night attendant at a flood control station out past the reservoir, isolated, no foot traffic, no residents, no one whose life depended on me being awake except my own, I took it almost the way another man might check himself into a monastery. I wanted to prove I could keep watch over nothing and do it perfectly. I wanted a clean record of 40,000 uneventful minutes to lay on top of those 40 bad ones, like a fresh sheet laid over a stain you can't get out. I told myself that if I could be reliable in a place where it didn't matter, maybe I could begin to believe I'd been reliable in the place where it had mattered most. That was the plan. That was the whole sad private plan, and I carried it up that service road like it was the only thing I owned. The man who hired me was named Marcus Holloway. He was the dayside supervisor, a thick, unhurried man who talked like answering a question cost him money out of his own pocket. He met me at the gate, which was a chain-link thing on a service road that climbed up the side of a hill above the valley. He didn't shake my hand. He looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. The way you'd look at a part you were checking against a list, and then he handed me a ring of keys and a clipboard. and walked me up the road while he told me what the place was, in short sentences, never quite finishing one before starting the next. The Halvern Reach Diversion Works had been built into the hillside decades ago to manage flood, water off the upper valley, pumping and diverting through a set of sluice gates when the reservoir got high. Most of it had been automated years back. There wasn't really a job to do anymore, in the sense of doing. There was only a job to be. Someone had to be physically present overnight, walk the gauges, sign the log, and call the regional dispatcher once a shift to confirm the station was secure. The company kept a human there because the insurance required it, and because the old systems were old enough that someone wanted a body nearby in case something failed in a way the sensors didn't catch. 4 nights on, dusk to dawn, then a relief shift covered the rest. I asked Holloway about the man before me, the one whose job I was taking. He said the guy had transferred. I asked transferred where. He didn't slow his stride. He said he didn't keep track of where people transferred to, and the flatness of the way he said it stuck with me even then, before I had any reason for it to stick. Then he added without my asking, that the previous man had been very reliable toward the end, very steady. He said toward the end the way another man might say it about someone who'd died, and then he caught himself, or seemed to, and said nothing else about it. I let it go. People leave jobs. That's not a mystery. That's a Tuesday. The station itself was a long spine of concrete corridors cut back into the rock, lit by sodium lights that turned everything the color of weak tea. The control room sat at the front, with a wall of analog gauges, a bank of 3 closed-circuit monitors showing the gate motors and the lower, galleries, a metal desk, a landline phone, and a tall gray cabinet bolted to the wall that held the logbooks. Behind the control room, the corridors ran back to the machinery, the big sluice gate motors that, Holloway told me, cycled on their own at 14 minutes past 3 every morning for an automated maintenance run, so I shouldn't be alarmed when they ran in the dead of night. He told me that twice as well, the exact time, 14 past 3, as if it were the kind of thing you might forget at your peril. And below all of it, down a caged ladder behind a heavy door, was the pump gallery, a sub-level that stayed half-flooded most of the year and smelled, when you opened the door to it, of wet limestone and something faintly sweet underneath, like the water at the bottom of a vase that's held flowers too long. From the control room window you could see the valley. The reservoir filled what had been a town, before they dammed it and let the water come up over the streets. At low season the water dropped enough that you could see rooftops breaking the surface, dark wet shapes lying just under the skin of the water, and a church spire, gray and patient, standing out of the reservoir like a finger held up to test the wind. Holloway told me the town's name once, and I've genuinely forgotten it, which used to seem ordinary and now seems like the first small thing the place took from me without my noticing. He told me people sometimes said they saw lights down there at night on the water near the spire, and he said it in a bored voice that made it clear he thought those people were fools, and that I would be a fool too if I started watching for it. I told myself I wouldn't watch for it. I watched for it every night. He showed me the routine, walk the corridor, check each gauge against the range marked in grease pencil on the glass, note the reading in the log with the time, watch for the gate motors cycling at 14 past 3, like clockwork, and confirm they completed their cycle. Call the dispatcher once between midnight and 2 on the landline, because the landline only reliably worked in that window, for reasons no one had ever explained to him. Sign the log at the end of the shift. That was it. He said the most important thing about the job, the only thing he really cared about, was that the log was complete and the times were right. He said it slowly, and he held my eyes while he said it, and for 1 second the boredom dropped out of his face and something careful came into it instead. I thought he was just being a bureaucrat. I understand now that he was telling me the one thing that mattered and hoping I'd take it seriously without him having to explain why, because explaining why might have meant admitting he knew something he had decided long ago not to know. The first 3 nights were exactly what I'd hoped for. Empty, slow mine. I walked the gauges. I watched the motors run at 14 past 3 and shut off again. I called the dispatcher, a woman named Sella whose voice on that crackling line was the only warm thing in the place, and she logged my call, and we said good night. I signed the log in handwriting that was, I'll admit, a little shaky those first nights, because I hadn't slept right in 2 years and my hands knew it. I sat at the desk and I watched the church spire fade into the dark and reappear at dawn, and I thought, I can do this. I can be a man who keeps watch. I should tell you about Sella properly here, while she was still simply a voice and not yet a wound. She was a regional dispatcher who covered a dozen of these remote sites, sitting in an office somewhere I never saw, watching a board of little lights that each stood for a lonely man in a concrete room. She'd been doing it for years. She had a dry, easy way of talking, and she never once treated me like a defective thing, which after 2 years of being handled gently by people who knew my history was its own kind of medicine. She asked me real questions. She asked whether I had a dog, and when I said no, she said a man out there should have a dog. And the next call she asked if I'd thought any more about the dog, and it became a small running thing between us, the dog I was always about to get. She told me about her garden, about a tomato plant that had grown up through a crack in her office's loading dock from a seed nobody planted, and how she'd decided to let it live and was watering it from a paper cup. Those calls, 11 minutes, 12 minutes, in the narrow window when the line worked, were the only time in those 4-night stretches that I spoke to another living person, and I came to need them the way you need a light left on. I would watch the clock crawl toward midnight just to have a reason to pick up the phone. It was on the 4th night that I found the recorder. I was looking through the gray cabinet for an older logbook, just out of boredom, wanting to see how far back the records went, behind the stack of bound logs, pushed to the back of the shelf where you wouldn't find it, unless you were reaching. There was a small handheld voice recorder, the kind people used to use for dictation. The battery was dead. I found a charger in the desk drawer that fit it, and while it charged, I turned it over in my hands and saw the 3 words scratched into the plastic casing. Don't believe yourself. I assumed it was a joke or a hungover note to self, the kind of thing a bored night shift man scratches into things to keep himself company. I didn't feel anything yet. That's worth remembering, that there was a moment when I held the whole thing in my hand and felt nothing at all. When it had charged enough, I pressed play, and a man's voice came out of it, tired but level, and it said a date and a time, and then it said, "This is just me keeping notes, because I keep forgetting things and I want a record outside my own head." Then it talked about the gauges, mundane stuff, a reading that was a little high, a motor that ran 6 seconds long, ordinary. The man's name, I gathered from a later memo, was Errol Pace, the man I'd replaced, the man who'd transferred. And near the end of that first memo, almost as an afterthought, in the same flat, tired voice, he said something that I rewound and listened to 4 times. He said, "Check the gallery camera tonight," and then lower, like he was reminding himself of a rule he'd written on the inside of his own skull, he said, "If you're already down there, don't go down." I told myself it was nonsense. A man talking to himself in the small hours. We all say strange things to ourselves at 4 in the morning. But I checked the gallery camera, the lowest of the 3 monitors, the one that looked down into the half-flooded pump gallery, and there was nothing there but black water, and the cage of the ladder and the slow drip of the place. Of course there was nothing. I was relieved in a way that I told myself was silly, and I went home at dawn and slept and came back the next night, and that's when the job stopped being the thing I'd signed up for and became the thing it actually was. The next night I went to write my first gauge reading in the log, and there was already an entry there, in the right place, at a time about 40 minutes before I'd arrived. In my handwriting, I want to be precise about this because it's the hinge of everything. It was not a sloppy entry. It was not gibberish. It was a clean, correct gauge reading, the kind I'd write, in handwriting that was unmistakably mine, dated that night, timed to before I'd come through the gate. I stood there with the pen in my hand and I read it over and over, and the first thing I felt before fear was something close to recognition, the way you feel when you walk into a room and can't remember why, but you know you meant to do something there. 40 minutes before I arrived, the number 40 sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. A normal man, a man without my history, might have laughed it off. Maybe I wrote it the night before and misdated it. Maybe Holloway wrote it to test me. But I am not a man without my history. I am a man who lost 40 minutes once and a woman died inside them. And so when I see evidence of myself doing something I don't remember doing, I don't feel confusion. I feel the floor go out from under me. I feel the old blank wall slide into place behind my eyes and I have to grip the desk. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself my mind was doing what tired minds do at night, filling gaps, playing tricks. But I wrote my real entry below the phantom one, and my hand was shaking worse than it had on the first night, and I noticed, with a cold little drop in my stomach, that the phantom entry above it was written in a steadier hand than my own. I called Sella early that night, before the window had even properly opened, just to hear a real voice. She picked up after a lot of crackling, and she said twice in one night, "You're keen," and I said, "What?" And she said, "You called earlier, about an hour ago, asked me to read back the gate motor schedule." I said I didn't call earlier. There was a pause on the line, a small, careful pause. She said, "Well, somebody did, and they sounded just like you." And then she laughed it off the way you do when you've decided something isn't worth the friction of arguing about. But I wrote down the time she said the earlier call had come in. And later, when I checked it against my own memory of the evening, it landed squarely inside a stretch where I'd been walking the gauges alone with no phone anywhere near me. I sat with that for a long time. Somebody had called her in my voice while I was 40 feet away with both hands full of clipboard, and she had spoken to him, and he had sounded like me, and he had asked her something perfectly reasonable, and she'd thought nothing of it, because why would she? On the third of the bad nights, the reservoir gave me the thing I have never been able to argue myself out of. I was at the window during the slow stretch after midnight, watching the water the way I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and the low season had pulled the level right down, so the drowned rooftops lay just under the surface and the church spire stood up clear against the moon. And there was a light down there, not on the water. Under it, a soft amber glow, low and steady, coming up through the black water from somewhere near the base of the spire, in the place where the drowned church would be. It did not flicker like a reflection. It did not move like a boat. It glowed the patient, waiting glow of a call light left on in an empty hallway, the exact soft amber of the light in room 6, and it stayed on, and it stayed on. And I stood at that window with my breath fogging the glass, and I could not make myself look away, and I could not make myself keep looking. I told myself it was the moon on a wet roof. I told myself 100 things, but I know the color of a call light that no one has answered. I have that color memorized. And down there under the reservoir, in a church that had been drowned before I was born, something was holding that color up out of the water toward the one window where I stood, as if to ask me the way that light had once asked me, "Where were you?" I started going through the old log books in earnest after that, not out of boredom now, out of need. I pulled them down one by one, decades of them, and I read the signatures at the bottom of each shift. There were a lot of different men over the years, different names. Hartley, Venz, a man who only ever signed with initials, Errol Pace for the most recent stretch before me. And here is the thing that made me sit down on the cold floor and not get up for a while. If you read the logs from oldest to newest, the handwriting drifts, not toward what you'd expect, not toward the loose declining scrawl of bored or tired or aging men. It drifts toward steadiness. Every man over his months at the Reach wrote more and more cleanly, more and more evenly, until the final entries of each one are almost mechanical in their neatness. And then that man transfers, and a new name appears, and the handwriting is shaky and human again, and over the months it tightens up toward that same impossible steadiness, like the place was teaching each of them the same penmanship, or like the same hand was slowly learning to wear different men. I looked at my own first entries, shaky and human, and I looked at the phantom entry from the night before, steady and clean, and I understood, in a way I couldn't yet put into words, that I was watching it happen to me. There was one more thing in those logbooks, and I almost missed it. Tucked between 2 pages near the end of Errol's stretch, there was a loose slip of paper, and on it, in 2 different hands, was a kind of conversation. The first line was shaky, frightened, the writing of a man whose grip on the pen kept failing. It said, "When did I eat last? I can't remember eating." And below it, in answer, in that clean, even steady hand, the same hand that signed the final entries, it said, "You ate, you're fine, stop counting." And below that, the shaky writing again, smaller now, almost too small to read, it said, "Who is writing the answers?" And there was no answer to that one. Just the rest of the slip left blank, and the blankness of it was worse than any answer could have been, because I recognized both hands. They were both mine, the frightened one and the steady one. I had found a man arguing with himself across a piece of paper, losing, and that man was me, and he had not even known yet that he was already 2 people. It was the next night that I looked at the lowest monitor and saw a man in the pump gallery. He was standing at the foot of the caged ladder, at the edge of the black water, and he had his back half to the camera, and he was doing something with his hands, checking a fitting, the unhurried, competent motions of a man who knows the work and is not afraid of it. He was wearing my jacket. He had my build, my way of standing with the weight on the left leg because of an old knee thing I've had since I was 19. And I was standing in the control room, 2 levels up, watching him on the screen, with my own 2 hands flat on the desk in front of me where I could see them. I want you to understand that I was not frightened in the way you'd expect. The thing that came over me was not a scream. It was a terrible, intimate cold, the cold of seeing yourself doing something you don't remember choosing to do, the exact cold of those 40 lost minutes given a body and a backside and a pair of working hands. It wasn't a monster down there, it was me. And I was good at the job, calm and sure and steady. That was the worst thing about it. I watched him for a long time. He never turned fully toward the camera. He finished whatever he was doing and he moved out of frame, deeper into the gallery, unhurried, and the screen went back to black water and the dripping cage. I didn't go down. Errol's voice held me at the desk like a hand pressed flat against my chest. If you're already down there, don't go down. I sat and I shook, and I wrote in the log, in my own bad handwriting, that I had observed an anomaly on the gallery camera at such and such a time, and I noted the time carefully, because the times were the only thing I had left to trust, and even as I wrote it I thought, but I'm the one writing this and I can't trust me, so what good is a record kept by the unreliable about the unreliable? The day after, I had a handover with Holloway, because the rotation put us face to face once a cycle. I tried to tell him. I was careful. I didn't say I'd seen myself in the gallery. I said I'd noticed some entries I didn't remember making, and I asked if anyone else had access to the log, and he looked at me with that flat, money-costing patience of his, and he said, "You told me about that last week." I said I didn't. He said you did, and he didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way you'd correct a man about the day of the week, certain and a little tired, and then he flipped to a page in the current log and turned it around to show me. And there was an entry in my handwriting, that steady, clean handwriting describing a calm and uneventful night, signed with my name, dated to a night I remembered as one of the bad ones. One of the nights the smell had come up thick, and I'd lost track of an hour. The entry said it had been quiet. The entry was a lie told in my own hand, and Holloway believed it because why wouldn't he? It was signed by me. He watched me read it. And then, quietly, not unkindly, in a voice that had the careful blankness of a man repeating something he'd been instructed to say long ago, he told me the previous men had all gone through a patch like this, that it passed, that the ones who lasted were the ones who stopped fighting the record and let the record be right. The ones who lasted. He had said toward the end about Errol, and now he was saying the ones who lasted about me, and I understood that he had stood in this exact handover, on this exact page with other men, more times than he wanted to count, and had learned to look away from what it meant. I went a little frantic after that, in a quiet, methodical way. I decided I would build a record the place couldn't forge. I started photographing the wall clock and the log entry together each time I wrote. I asked Sella to note the exact minute of every call and to read it back to me so I'd have her independent record. I taped small folded notes to objects around the control room, the cabinet, the underside of the desk, the phone, and on each note I wrote a question and the time, so that if I lost a stretch and came back, I could check whether the notes had been touched. I was trying to triangulate my own existence. I was trying to catch the seam. For 2 nights it almost worked. I felt, for the first time since the care home, like a man building a wall against his own unreliability, instead of just standing in front of it. And then on the 3rd night of my little system, I went to check the note I'd taped under the desk, the one that said in my hand, "Did you go down? What time is it?" And below my question, that steady, clean handwriting, there was an answer. It said, "You know what time it is." It said, "Stop taping notes, it's embarrassing." And it was signed with my initials. I had been answering my own notes without knowing it, or something wearing my hand had been answering them. And either way, the wall I'd built had a door in it that I kept walking through in the gaps. And on the other side of the door, someone with my handwriting was patiently undoing everything I did to protect myself. And worse than that, he was gentle about it. Embarrassing. He pitied me. The steady one pitied the shaking one, the way you pity a stage of grief you've already finished. I called Seela that night with my hands cold, and I asked her straight to read me back every call I'd made that week with the times. And she got quiet, and then she did it, and the times were wrong. Calls at hours I'd been walking the corridor. A call, she said, had lasted 11 minutes that I had no memory of at all, in which, she said, I'd asked her a strange question. I asked her what question. She didn't want to say. I pushed, and she said in a small voice that had lost all its dryness, "You asked me how long a person can be replaced before the person stops counting." And then there was a long silence on the line, and into it she said, very gently, the way you'd talk to someone standing too close to an edge, "I let the tomato plant die." She said it had been weeks since she'd thought to water it. She said it like a confession, like she was offering me a small true thing to prove she was still really there, still the same person I'd been talking to. And then she said, "Are you doing okay out there?" And I realized she was frightened, not of the station, of me, of the voice on her line that sounded like me and asked questions I didn't remember asking. She was the last warm thing, the dog I never got, the tomato plant, the only person in 2 years who'd talked to me like a man and not a fault report, and the warmth in her voice had turned to the careful kindness you show something you're not sure is safe. That was the night I lost her, not because she hung up, but because I understood I'd become, to the one person who cared, a thing to be careful around. And here's where I made the mistake. I want to tell it honestly because if I dress it up as bad luck, you'll learn nothing, and Errol left those tapes so that someone would learn something. I broke his rule on purpose with my eyes open, and I broke it for a reason that made perfect sense to the broken man I am. I decided to go down to the gallery. I decided to go down and confront the thing wearing my jacket and my knee and my handwriting, because I had spent 2 years not knowing what happened in a gap, and I physically could not, spend another stretch of my life standing in front of a blank wall and being told I'd done things I couldn't remember doing. I needed to know which of us was real. I needed to stand in front of it and prove to it, to myself, to the woman in room 6, to anyone, that I was the man and it was the gap, and not the other way around. Errol's voice said don't go down, and I loved that voice by then. I trusted it more than I trusted my own. But the whole sickness of that place is that it makes trusting another voice over your own feel like wisdom, right up until it's the thing that finishes you. I told myself I was being brave. I see now I was being driven by the oldest wound I have, straight into the one trap the place had been laying for every shaking man whose handwriting ever steadied on those pages. I opened the heavy door behind the control room. The smell came up at me, wet limestone and that sweet rot underneath, thick now, thicker than it had ever been, sweet enough to coat the back of my throat. I went down the caged ladder into the cold with a flashlight, into the pump gallery where the black water lay flat and patient between the old machines. The motors had run their 14 past 3 cycle an hour before, and the place was dead still. My light moved over the water and the pipes and the green-furred concrete, and I found, sitting on a dry ledge at the foot of the ladder, exactly where a man would set something down so he wouldn't lose it, a recorder. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment everything else was leading to, and I have lived it so many times in my head that I can take it apart second by second. It was not Errol's recorder. It was newer, the same model the company kept in the desk drawer upstairs. I crouched and I picked it up, and it was warm. Warm the way a thing is warm when a hand has only just left it. In that cold gallery, with my breath showing in the flashlight beam and the black water absolutely still, the warmth of that small plastic thing in my palm was the most frightening thing I have ever touched. Because warmth means recently, warmth means someone. Warmth means he was here a moment ago and I did not pass him on the ladder. I knelt there feeling that warmth bleed slowly out into my cold hand, and I did not want to press play, and I pressed play, and it was my voice. My voice calm, level, much calmer than I had been in weeks, reading off a series of memos, and the memos were dated. Some of them were dated to nights that had already happened, nights I had lived through shaking and afraid, and on the recorder my own calm voice described those same nights as quiet, uneventful, well-managed, the gauges good, the log complete. I sat down on the ledge then because my legs would not hold the next part, because some of the memos, and I played them twice to be sure, were dated to nights that had not happened yet. Future nights, next week, my own voice already recorded, in that flat, steady tone with no shake in it anywhere, describing shifts I had not yet worked, telling me everything was fine. Everything was under control. The motors had cycled on time at 14 past 3. The dispatcher call was logged. Nothing to report. Someone had already lived my next week, calmly and well, and recorded it, and set it warm on a ledge for me to find, the way a man leaves a clean copy of a document on top of the messy original so the messy one can be thrown away. I don't remember climbing back up the ladder. That's not a figure of speech. There is a seam there, a smooth blank wall, and I have felt around the edges of it the way your tongue goes to a missing tooth, and there is nothing. The last thing I have is sitting on the ledge with the warm recorder, and the sweet smell, and my own future voice in my ears. And then the next thing I have is morning, gray light in the control room, the church spire standing up out of the reservoir, and the log in front of me filled out completely for the night in clean, even, steady handwriting, every gauge noted, the motorcycle confirmed, the dispatcher call logged, all of it perfect, all of it in my hand, none of it remembered. Days went by like that. I would rip shaking and afraid, and I would leave with a perfect log and no memory of the hours that filled it, and each morning the handwriting was steadier. And each morning I had to look at my own hands to be sure they were still the ones I'd grown up with. The scratch recorder, Errol's recorder, the one that had been my one anchor, was gone. I tore the cabinet apart looking for it. It was not there. In its place, in the back of the shelf where I'd first found Errol's, sat the new one, the one from the gallery, with my own calm future voice inside it. The warning had been replaced by the thing it warned about. I understood then, in the cold, clear way, you understand things only after they're already done, that this was the shape of it, that this was what transfer meant, that Errol had not transferred anywhere, that the steady-handed men in the old logbooks had not gone on to other sites, that the place did not kill its watchers, and it did not chase them, and it did not eat them. It simply slowly completed them, smoothed them out. Replaced the shaking human version with the calm, steady one that kept a perfect log and called the dispatcher in a voice that sounded a little too much like the last man's, until there was nothing left in the chair that remembered being afraid, or being anyone in particular at all. I tried to do it the right way. I want that on the record, for whatever record kept by me is worth. I filed an incident report with the company. I wrote it carefully in daylight, away from the station, with my own present shaking hand, and I described the lost time, the phantom entries, the figure in the gallery, the recorder with the future dates. I gave times. I tried to be the reliable man I'd come there to become one last time. On paper, the report came back to me 3 weeks later in an envelope with no note. Across the top of my own statement, someone had stamped a line saying the matter had been reviewed and closed. And down the body of it, every place where I had written a specific time, every place where I had pinned an event to the clock, the time had been struck out, a clean black bar through it redacted. They had taken away the only thing Errol said mattered. They had taken away the times. Without the times, my whole account was just a frightened man saying frightened things, and they knew it, and that was the point. Attached behind my report was a single sheet I was clearly not meant to read closely, a closure notice for the Halvern Reach Diversion Works, citing an automation upgrade that would remove the requirement for an overnight human presence. The station was being closed, and on that notice, in the line for the site's last assigned guard, was my name, with a start date 2 years before I had ever heard of the place. 2 years before. Right around the time, give or take a few weeks, that I lost 40 minutes in the east wing of a care home and a woman in room 6 pressed a light that no one answered. I have tried very hard not to follow that thought all the way down. I have not always succeeded. Holloway stopped returning my calls. The regional office number gave a recording. I drove out to the gate once near the end, and it was chained shut with a new lock, and the sodium lights inside the corridors were dark, and the church spire stood up out of the gray water exactly as it always had. Patient, like it could wait out anything, like it had already waited out a whole drowned town and would wait out me too. I sat in my car outside the locked gate for a long time, and I did not feel relief, and I did not feel safe, and I want to be honest that what I felt was something closer to homesickness, a horrible pull toward the place, like part of me had been left down in the gallery on that warm, dry ledge and was patiently calling the rest of me back to come and finish. There is one more thing, and then I'll stop, because I can hear in my own voice the thing I'm most afraid of, and I want to say this last part while I'm still the one saying it. When everything was closed and stamped and locked, I sat down one night with the new recorder, the one with my future voice on it, and I played the very last memo, the one dated furthest ahead, wanting, the way I always want, to know the thing at the bottom. And before that final memo, there was an older file I hadn't noticed, dragged over into the recorder's memory from somewhere, and I played it. And it was Errol. Errol's voice, the tired level voice I'd loved and rationed and trusted with my life, the voice that had kept me alive at that desk on the night I saw myself below, except that as I listened to it that night in my own kitchen, clean, with no station hum around it, no fear in my own ears coloring it, I heard it properly for the first time. And it was my voice.
Mine.
The same catch on the hard words, the same breath drawn in before a sentence I didn't want to say, the same flat way of reporting the worst things. Learned in a care home, learned in front of a blank wall. Errol paced the man before me, the man whose warning had held me at the desk, the man whose rule I had broken, was me, recorded on a night I never lived by a version of myself I don't remember being, scratched with 3 words and left in a cabinet for the next shaking, frightened version to find and trust and love and disobey. And I sat there in my kitchen with the dead recorder in my hand, and I grieved for Errol Pace the way you grieve a friend, before I understood that I was grieving myself. And then I understood, and there was nowhere for the grief to go. There was never a man before me. There was never a man before him. There is only ever the one watcher, going around and around the same wheel, leaving notes for himself in the dark, scratching the same 3 words into the casing for the next turn, and the words were never advice. They were a description. They were a confession written in advance. Don't believe yourself, because by the time you find them, the self you'd be believing is already mostly gone, already mostly the steady one, already mostly the thing the place makes, and the part of you that could be warned is just a warm fading shape on a ledge in the cold. I have made a new recording. I made it tonight, in my own kitchen, with the doors locked, with my own shaking present hand. I'm going to find a way to leave it where the next one will find it, even though the station is closed, even though there is supposed to be no next one, because I have learned not to trust what is supposed to be. And before I leave it, I am going to take the point of a key and scratch 3 words into the side of it. And I already know what they'll be, And I already know my hand won't shake when I do it, because my handwriting doesn't shake anymore. It's steady now, perfectly steady. It got steady somewhere in those last lost nights, and it has stayed that way. And every time I look at it, I feel the cold of the gallery on my palm, and a little of that warmth bleeding out into my hand. So here is the only true thing I can give you. You have been listening this whole time to a calm voice telling you a frightening story in a careful, orderly way, beginning to end, times and details and feelings all in their proper place. You have probably found it believable. That calm, that order, that steadiness is exactly the thing the place makes. The shaking man who drove up that service road to lay a clean record over 40 bad minutes is not the man speaking to you now. I don't know when the handover happened. I have felt along the edge of it 1,000 times and there is no seam, only the smooth wall, only the place where the join should be and isn't. And so I will tell you the 3 words I scratched into the casing, the words every turn of me has scratched into every casing, the one honest thing left in this whole account, a warning that has to include itself or it isn't honest at all. Don't believe yourself. And since you have spent this last hour listening so closely to me, and since I can no longer be sure which one of us I am, the steady one or the one who still remembers being afraid, I have to tell you the rest of it too. Don't believe me either.